All right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that we're about ready to begin. Everybody, this is Lydia McGrew. She wrote the book Undesigned Coincidences.
Hi, Lydia.
You and your
Lydia.
husband,
Hey.
Tim, have been involved in this for years, and I've seen a lot of work by the two of you together. In the natural theology book, you've got that article that you two wrote, and I have read your critique of Habermas's Minimal Facts also. So you've done quite a bit of work in apologetics, even aside from undesigned coincidences. But this one is the one that's most exciting to me, and I think you as well. I'm not positive, but I think that that's the case. I'm really happy to have you here. We're very happy to have you here this evening. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lydia, for being here.
Great to be here.
And we're ready when you are.
Okay. Well, thank you, Robert, for inviting me, and thank you to Mike for setting this up. And I'm really glad for the opportunity to be here. And I understand you have a rather long meeting, so I've made a rather long talk for you. And then we'll have a chance to go to a Q&A. And so I really hope and pray that this will strengthen your faith tonight and be useful to you. So my book is called Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. Tim introduced me, my husband introduced me to this argument first. And then it just was happenstance that I had the time to write the book before he did. So the book is dedicated to him, among others, because really I didn't get this on my own. I just happened to be the one to write this book. What is an undesigned coincidence? That's the obvious first question that somebody's going to ask. So what I will do is I will give a brief definition, and then I'm going to let you come to understand undesigned coincidences a little better through, and hopefully a lot better, through examples, because I really believe that people understand the concept better through examples than through definitions. So I'll just give the brief definition that I like to give: an incidental interlocking that points to truth. An undesigned coincidence is an incidental interlocking that points to truth. Let's suppose one morning you come to work and one of your coworkers comes in and he says, "Man, I saw the worst accident at," and he names an intersection not far from where your office is. And he goes into talking about, how terrible it was, and it involved a truck and a car. Several hours passed, and another coworker comes in. Maybe this person doesn't have to be there as early as the two of you do. And he comes in and he says, "I'm really worried that I have a flat tire." He says, I gotta go out a little while later and look, but it was not looking too good. You say, "Oh, why? What happened?" And he says, "Well, I drove past the intersection of," and he names the same intersection, "and there was all this glass in the road. And I heard a crunch, and I really think I must have driven over some of that glass. This is not good. I'm afraid I have a flat tire." Now, that is an example of an undesigned coincidence. Your two coworkers are talking about different aspects of the same thing. If there was indeed an accident at that intersection, you would expect to find glass in the intersection. But notice that they don't both say exactly the same thing. One of them says, "I witnessed an accident," and he describes it. The other one doesn't say even that there was an accident, though he probably figures that there was, but he says that there was glass in the road and that he drove his car over it. Now, it is barely possible that your two coworkers are playing an elaborate trick on you and that they decided yesterday that they were going to do this and they're making the whole thing up. But that's not only unlikely anyway, because it's kind of a pointless hoax, but it's also unlikely that if they did so, the content of what they've said would be this content. Because it takes a lot of artistry, not simply to say, "I saw that accident, yeah, I saw that accident too," but to name details that are somewhat different and yet that fit together, as the accident fits together with the broken glass. This is not something we generally find in colluding people. Their energy tends to be directed towards making sure they don't contradict one another, directing towards telling a long, consistent tale. Now, when you're just telling the truth, you don't have to worry about that because reality is consistent. So you just tell what you know. You just tell what occurs to you or what you're interested in talking about. And if you speak truthfully, that will be consistent with what someone else says who speaks truthfully. Sometimes it might appear to be inconsistent. We do get apparent discrepancies. in truthful testimony. But if it is truthful, they are only apparent. And in this case, there's no even apparent discrepancy. They fit together. So that's an example of an undesigned coincidence. I want to tell you that you're using this argument all the time, and I hope you'll see that from the example that I just gave. This is not some special Bible thing. It isn't a technical concept in biblical studies. In fact, where it probably has a great deal of relevance, in fact, maybe even the most relevance, is in a court of law, where you're interviewing various people, some of whom might be telling lies, and you're trying to find out who's telling lies and who's telling the truth and what the truth is and what really happened and so forth. But you're using it all the time, just not by that name, when you have to disentangle what people are telling you, when you have to try to verify a news report. And you don't want to just go read another news report that was copied from the first one. You want to try to read an independent report and see if they're both getting at different aspects, different facets of the same story. That's undesigned coincidences that you're using. At this point, I'm going to go in and talk about some examples of these in the Gospels. And then the second part of my talk will be about examples of undesigned coincidences in Acts. Undesigned, of course, refers to the fact that it appears that they weren't done on purpose to fake. So as I said concerning the flat tire story, it doesn't appear that your coworkers have gotten together and faked this. It looks very natural. It looks very casual, that the one just says he saw an accident and the other just says he's afraid his car has a flat tire because he drove through some glass. That's the of undesignedness, and that's what gives these their force. It's a much greater force than we would have if you just had two people saying exactly the same thing. Because if they were saying exactly the same thing, we might start worrying that they copied from one another, that they were just influencing one another, maybe even that they would all say this even if it were untrue. So it's that appearance of undesignedness that really gives these their kick. So I want to start with one that's pretty quick to state. This begins in Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. For most of my coincidences tonight, I will be citing the verses. I will not necessarily be looking them up and reading them, so I'll paraphrase. Occasionally I'll look up and read it word for word, but feel free to flip through in your Bible and check it out for yourself. That's certainly something I want people to do. I'm always encouraging people to check things out for themselves in their Bibles. Don't just take my word for it. In Matthew 14, verses 1 and 2, Matthew's talking about Herod, and he's about to tell the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. Now Herod hears that Jesus has been doing miracles and that his disciples have been doing miracles. And Herod says to his servants, it says in Matthew, "This must be John the Baptist risen from the dead. That's why he's doing all of these miracles." It's a little bit of a strange thing for Herod to say, since John the Baptist apparently never did any miracles. But never mind. Herod was apparently guilty. He had a guilty conscience. And this leads us into the flashback where Matthew tells the story about Herod's having John beheaded and what happened and how that all went. And that's the story of, Salome with the 7 veils and all of that. The dancing daughter who asked for John's head on a silver charger. Now, this story, as given in Matthew, is very similar to the same story given in Mark, and I'll be coming back to that in a minute. But that one little phrase that Herod said at servants is not found in Mark. It's not found in any of the other Gospels. It's found only in Matthew. That when Herod said, "This must be John the Baptist risen from the dead," Herod had this superstitious fear. He was musing about this to his servants. Now, if you think about that, a skeptic, or even a liberal New Testament scholar who might not regard himself as a skeptic, is probably going to consider that to be fake. He's probably going to say, Matthew is trying to make this sound real by throwing in some sort of unnecessary detail. You might read occasionally children's history. I read some of these things because I homeschool my kids, and so I have our history for children's stories where it'll write it up. Right? This is the story of Galileo, and we're going to add dialogue, and we're going to say, Galileo set down his cup of coffee or wine or whatever we think Galileo was drinking and said such and such to his friend. "Gee, you wouldn't believe what I saw in the telescope today." And usually they do it better than that. I'm kind of making fun of it. But the point is, you get these semi-fictionalized histories where they will go into additional detail that when you read it, you know perfectly well the author wasn't there and doesn't really know. He's fleshing it out. He's making a scene. He's making it flow like a story to make it sound more interesting so the kids will enjoy reading it and so forth, to make a reading section or a reading assignment or something and teach them some historical information at the same time. Now, some people think the Gospels are like that, based on the life of Jesus, but not really accurate in their details. And this one would be a prime candidate for something that Matthew just threw in there without knowing. Because after all, you might say, how could Herod possibly be saying this to his servants and Matthew know? How could Matthew know what Herod is saying in the privacy of his own palace to his own servants? Herod's a very important person. Matthew, if he was Matthew, is a follower of Jesus, but in any event, he's a member of the Christian community. How does he know what Herod's saying to his servants? He might write this off as a fictionalized detail. Not so, however. Let's go to Luke chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. Here, Luke is not talking about the beheading of John the Baptist. I want to emphasize again, this is a completely different context. Jesus is going on his travels from a certain town, and Luke just decides to start telling you about some women who were accompanying Jesus and his disciples on their travels and were contributing financially to their ministry. And he lists them. He has this list. He lists Susanna. He lists Mary Magdalene. Gives a little fact about her, out of whom Jesus cast 7 demons. And then he says, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. And then it just goes on. Very casual. Oh, all right. So a woman who was a close follower of Jesus, who contributed financially to his ministry, and in that culture, I think she would have had to have the support of her husband in doing so, was married to Herod's steward. So you get a little bit of chat in the Chuza household about what happened at the office that day, and now we know how word got back, or could very plausibly have gotten back, to Matthew the evangelist about what Herod was musing to his servants, what he was saying about John the Baptist and about Jesus. Now, I love that one because it's completely different context. There is no way that Luke deliberately inserted that into his narrative. It could so easily be missed. You think about that. If Luke went to the trouble, I think he probably did have access to Matthew. I think he probably had read Matthew. But you can't imagine you saying, hey, I'll make up a woman named Joanna, the wife of who's a Herod's household manager, and I'll just stick her into a list in a completely different place so that when people are reading it, maybe they'll notice this weird little thing that Matthew says over here. Now, he was probably making it up, but I'll just stick it in there. It'll look like it fits together. It'll make me look truthful. It'll make Matthew look truthful. It'll be great. I really find that an enormously implausible hypothesis. It's casual. It has that appearance of undesignedness, and yet it fits together the way that truth fits together. Let's look at another one. When we go to Mark chapter 14, verses 57 and following, we find Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin. So here we are at the Passion of Jesus. And he's being tried before them, and they're trying to find witnesses to say that he's blasphemed and say bad stuff about him. And what we find are witnesses saying this weird thing. They say, we heard him say that he would destroy the temple and raise it up again in 3 days. Now, that's just odd. If they were just trying to get him in trouble, you can maybe imagine that they would lie and say, we heard him say you would destroy the temple. That's a very inflammatory thing to say in first century Judea. You don't talk about destroying the temple in AD 33 in Jerusalem any more than you talk about carrying a bomb on an airplane when you're walking through the TSA. It's just some things you don't joke about. All right? So yes, that would have been a very angering thing for the Jews to hear. So if they were just false witnesses, you can imagine that they might have said that. But what's about this bit about, and in 3 days, I will raise it up again. You know, I'm going to destroy the temple and raise the temple up again. Why would they just lie and make that part up if they're trying to portray Jesus as some kind of terrorist or something, they're not going to say that he's promising to recreate the temple in 3 days. So, you know what that sounds like? It sounds like something that got garbled in the translation. If you read a story like that online, you would start Googling. You'd start trying to find where did this come from? What did he really say? It sounds like a garbled version of something Jesus said originally that got messed up by gossip, okay, by people talking about it or misremembering it or mishearing it or getting mad and then going away and getting confused about what he really said, and now they come and say this at his trial. Well, now, some of you may know what they're referring to, and you know that because you know your Bible. In a very odd sense, sometimes the force of undesigned coincidences can be a little bit undermined by the fact that we know our Bibles almost too well. Because we know the answer. It's like I'm trying to build up this big mystery. What are they talking about? And you're like, I know what they're talking about, Lydia. Stop going on and on and on. But what you might not know is that that's not found in Matthew or in Mark or in Luke. The answer as to what these witnesses are alluding to is not found anywhere in the Synoptic Gospels. It's found later, only, uniquely, in the Gospel of John. John says, back in John 2, again, a completely different context, Jesus is the temple. And as you'll see later, I think Jesus cleansed the temple twice. He's cleansed the temple early in his ministry. And they come and they start asking him, what's going on, and who do you think you are that you're doing this? And in the context of that, he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And the Jews understand him to be speaking of the temple. No doubt Jesus was pulling their chains somewhat, and they said this temple took 46 years to build and so forth, and you're going to raise it up again in 3 days. And then John pauses and puts in a little editorial comment. They didn't know that he was speaking of the temple of his body, that it was a prophecy of his resurrection. Okay, so completely different context. John explains this trial scene that then occurred 3 years later in the Synoptics being Matthew, Mark, and Luke, by the way, before the Sanhedrin. This is what had occurred. This is what Jesus had really said, and they'd remembered it and seethed over it and howled against him all that time, and then they bring it up. Now, what we've got here are different directions. In the first coincidence I gave you, Luke explains something that is unique to Matthew. Here we find John, again incidentally and with apparent casualness, explaining something that is unique to the Synoptic Gospels. Because John doesn't have the people say he said he would destroy the temple and raise it up again. So John didn't fake that comment earlier in order to set up the stage for that accusation later in the trial, because he doesn't have the accusation later in the trial. I also wanted to go back briefly to the one about Herod and his servants. You will often find the idea that Matthew was just redacting Mark in many places, especially where Matthew and Mark are very verbally similar. And the passage about Herod and the beheading of John is very similar in Matthew and Mark, but it appears that Matthew has information that Mark doesn't have in just a small little phrase, not in a completely separate incident, but in a phrase that's inserted into material that New Testament scholars would often take to be merely copied from Mark by Matthew, or maybe fictionally redacted by Matthew, but instead we find that the very change, quote unquote, that Matthew made to Mark seems to reflect independent evidence, independent access to the data that Matthew himself had. It's a very important thing to know about and to remember, because it's not a popular position in New Testament scholarship today to hold that Matthew knew what was going on independently of Mark, independently of Q or whatever, that he just knew people who knew what had happened, or even, really more shocking idea, that he witnessed the events himself because he really was Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples. So now I'm going to move on to the next incident. This is a twofer. And we find that these kind of twofers happen sometimes between the Gospels, where one coincidence will go one direction. One gospel will explain, gospel A will explain gospel B, and then another coincidence concerning that same passage, gospel B will explain gospel A, back in the opposite direction. And that's what this is like. So I'm going to pack these together. These concern Jesus' foot washing on the night of the Last Supper, the night in which he was betrayed. His foot washing, and it concerns the Last Supper and some words that we're told that he said at the Last Supper. So let's just start with the general question. Why did Jesus wash the disciples' feet? If you never asked yourself that question before, he wanted to illustrate an important lesson. There isn't always any special why. John simply said that he loved them. He says, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them until the end. John 13:1. And supper being ended, Jesus arose from supper and took off his clothes and girded himself and washed their feet. So, of course, John's relating it. John, the apostle of love, is relating it to Jesus' love for his disciples. Well, that'll work. But was there maybe some more specific reason why Jesus washed their feet? Well, if you go to Luke 22 and 24, verse 24, you find the disciples had been arguing among themselves about a very common topic that the disciples like to argue about. What was it? Go ahead, tell me, come on. What did the disciples argue about a lot in the Gospels?
Who's going to be first?
Yep.
Yep. Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? You got it. It's exactly right. And that's what they were arguing about on one of the most sacred nights in all of human history. That's what they were arguing about. And now we start to see a very special reason for that night why Jesus might have washed their feet. Because this is what they're doing. All right? They're bickering like little kids about who's going to be first in the kingdom. And so Jesus rises up and washes their feet. But the foot washing doesn't appear in Luke. And the statement that they were arguing doesn't appear in John. Okay? As a matter of fact, I was just reading a scholar recently who questions whether they were arguing on that night at all. Thinks that Luke might have moved that argument from somewhere else and puts it on the night of the Last Supper. But the fact that it fits with the foot washing is some evidence that he didn't move it from anywhere else and that they really were arguing on that particular night. Why not? It would provide a good explanation for Jesus washing their feet. But now, like I said, I told you this was a twofer, so I want to pay that coupon here, pay that promissory note. Let's go the other way. In Luke 22:27, Jesus has a passage, and this time I am going to actually read this because I'm going to have a little digression on redaction theory. I told you were going to get a really meaty talk tonight. Luke 22:27. And then I'm going to back up from that a little bit. All right, I'm going to start here with their fighting, which is just after the institution of the Lord's Supper. Great time to fight, boys. All right, and they began to discuss among themselves which one of them it might be who was going to betray him. All right, and there arose also a dispute among them, verse 24, as to which one of them was regarded to be greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you, but let him who is the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as the servant. For who is greater, the one who reclines at table or the one who serves? Is not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves. I am among you as the one who serves. Now we are so used to sermon after sermon after sermon on Jesus the servant, right? Jesus is the servant. Jesus is the servant. And what we think of, he died, right? Okay? Philippians, he came and took on him the form of the servant, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death. And that's what we think of, but he hasn't died yet. And he speaks in the present tense. He says, I am among you as the one who serves. This is very vivid. What is it talking about? Well, if we know that he has washed their feet that night, now he can be gesturing to himself. I am among you as the one who serves. So now we start to get a vivid picture of what happened that night. But I'm going to put in another piece of this vivid picture. I want to go back to Mark 10, verses 35 and following. This is about a week, probably, previous. It's before the triumphal entry, but he's predicting his death, and he has been traveling to Jerusalem for the last time. Mark 10, verses 35 and following. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to him saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant that we may sit in your glory, one on your right and one on your left." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking for. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, that is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant toward James and John. And calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them, but it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Now here we do find it connected to his death, his servanthood connected to his death. But this is apparently a different incident. The triumphal entry takes place after that. They come to Jericho in the very next verse. And their mother is there, and we don't have any reason to think she was there on the night of the Last Supper. This just doesn't appear to happen at the Last Supper at all. In fact, he has to call them to himself to make these comments about the kings of the Gentiles. Now, sure as God made little green apples, I said to myself when I noticed that, some literary critic, New Testament critic, is going to say that Luke moved it. And they did. I found that the other day as I was reading. And it says, Luke decided to tell this logion of Jesus at a different occasion, all right? But let's get a more vivid picture. Mommy comes with James and John, and she brings them, and they start talking, and she asks, and they ask if they can sit on his right hand and his left, and the other disciples overhear this. They're not pleased. And after that dialogue, they start giving James and John a hard time. You had to get your mommy to come and ask that Jesus would make you right and left-handed in his kingdom, and give me a break, who do you think you are, etc. And Jesus hears that, and he calls them to himself, and he starts speaking, and he says, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers among the Gentiles lord it over them. Their great men exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you." A week passes. The disciples have not forgotten. It's the night of the Last Supper. And there's a lull after Jesus has consecrated the bread and the wine, and after Jesus has done the institution of the Lord's Supper. And in that lull, what do? They start giving James and John a hard time again, right? I mean, any of you who have children know that if there is a source of bickering and anger among them, it doesn't go away just because you talk to them one time. You know that. It happens all the time. The same thing will come up again. Remember that time that you did that? Right? Remember that time you took the last cookie? All right, so this is the same thing. Yeah, well, James and John, remember last week they came with Mommy to ask if they could sit on the right and left hand of Jesus. Oh, yeah? Well, he said that I might, and he said I could drink his cup, and maybe I will. Oh, give me a break. Who do you think you are? And Jesus gets up. He doesn't say a word. And he takes off his outer garment, and he girds himself as a servant, and he washes their feet. And he sits down, and John says, "Do you know what I've done to you? If I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet." And then he says, "Let's take this from the top, boys. The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship among them, and those who are great are called their benefactors. But it shall not be so among you, for whoever is the greatest should be the servant of all." Who is greater? The one who reclines at the table, or the one who serves? But I am among you is the one who serves. And now we have a vivid picture of the entire thing. And you know what? It involves Jesus saying the same thing twice. What do you know? And I'm going to tell you, if you have a friend who is a New Testament critic, be careful if you ever suggest to him that Jesus did the same thing twice. Because if you walk up to your New Testament critic friend and you say, I've been reading my Bible, I think Jesus cleansed the temple twice, he will break out in hives. I'm just telling you right now, have your EpiPen on hand or your Benadryl or something so that you can help him out so he doesn't have a serious allergic reaction, because New Testament critics are very allergic to the idea that Jesus did anything twice, especially if it's a relatively long bit of language like we have here about the kings of the Gentiles. Then they're like, oh, look at these verbal similarities. Probably didn't say the same thing twice. But it happens all the time, especially teachers and parents and other people who have followers and those that they're trying to teach. The next one I call in the book, Why is Jesus Being So Mean? This starts in John 21. So this is a post-resurrection appearance. I note this emphasizes a miracle. We do not find undesigned coincidences occurring only in non-miraculous parts of the text, nor do we find them occurring only in miraculous parts of the text. They are scattered like raisins in a good raisin bread. They're all throughout the loaf. They're all throughout the Gospels, just sort of randomly, just like you would expect if they were just telling the truth. All right, you can sample it here, there, beginning, middle, end, mundane to the miraculous, and you'll find it. This one obviously concerns a miracle because it concerns an appearance of Jesus, and it's a unique appearance. It's only in John. This is when Jesus comes to the Sea of Galilee, and they've been fishing all night, and they have a great haul of fishes, and they're eating fish with Jesus there. Afterwards, they come to land, they bring the fish to land, and he's already cooking fish. Don't know where he got those from. And they're talking, okay? And Jesus turns to Peter, and in this famous scene, he says, Peter, do you love me more than these guys do? And Peter is like, Jesus, you know that I love you. He doesn't say, I love you more than they do. Now, this is interesting because we know Jesus is always telling them not to compare themselves to one another. Jesus took it in view of that, as we saw in previous coincidences. So why is Jesus starting it? Why is he saying, do you love me more than these do? That's odd. Why is he seemingly encouraging Peter to compare himself to the others? Now, here we go again. If you know your Bible, you know the answer. Because a while ago, just a few days before, all right, before Jesus died, Jesus was telling him he was going to die, and he was going to say, he says, they will smite the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. You will all flee. You will all forsake me tonight. And Peter said, all of them may flee, but I will never flee. I will always stand by you, Jesus. And then, of course, we know that he didn't. Now, John does have Peter's denial of Jesus, and he has some great details about it. And John does have Peter's protestations that he will not forsake Jesus, that he'll go with him to death. But what John doesn't have is Peter's comparison of himself with the other disciples. That Peter says, they may all, though all others should forsake you, I will never forsake you. That contrast is only in the Synoptic Gospels. It's not in John. So John hasn't set this up. John hasn't foreshadowed or anything, which leads us to think that he's just telling the conversation the way he remembers it. He's not doing this literary invention. He's telling something he remembers, that Jesus turned to Peter and said, do you love me more than these do? Of course, John knows why he said that. But John's not composing a literary document. He's composing a memoir. And so he doesn't feel like, oh, I got to be sure to go back and put that in, to kind of build it up. Peter bragged that he would not forsake even though they did, and then he does, and then Jesus says, do you love me more than these two? He doesn't bother to craft it like that. He tells what occurs to him. This is how real people talk. All right. Last one from the Gospels I'm going to do, and then we'll do some next ones. Robert likes this one. So I'm including it. This one's for you, Robert.
Thank you.
All right. This is why did Jesus ask Philip? For this, we have to go back to the feeding of the 5,000. Of all of the incidents in Scripture, I believe, the feeding of the 5,000 has the largest number of undesigned coincidences connected with a single incident. I'm just going to give you one. The rest of them are in the book. Buy my book. Read my book. So I'm just going to give you one. Why do you think there might be so many undesigned coincidences connected with the feeding of the 5,000? Any conjectures out there?
Everybody was there?
Everybody was there. All right, that's a good idea. There were so many people there. Let's carry that out a little. Partly because everybody was there, it's one of the only miracles that's included in all four Gospels. So we have 4 different accounts of it. That gives us all these opportunities for these undesigned coincidences because they each tell something a little bit different. All right? The synoptics, as usual, tend to be quite similar, and John's somewhat different, but we get this stereoscopic view of the feeding of the 5,000 where we're seeing it from both sides. Okay? So we start in John 6:5. Jesus is resting. He's actually been healing the people all day. You don't get that from John. You get that from the Synoptic Gospels, that it's been going on already. This isn't when he first sees the crowd. But he takes a little breather on the mountain, and he's sitting there, and the people want, more Jesus. Like Chick-fil-A. Eat more chicken, all right? Listen to more Jesus. So they come to him, toward him, probably seeking more healing and so forth. And he realizes it's getting to be evening. And so he asks the disciples, where can we buy bread that these may eat? Now that's in the Synoptics. But what's in John is that he turns to Philip. Specifically Philip. This is unique to John, that he says, where can we buy bread that these may eat? Now, as John points out, he's pulling their chain. All right, it's not like he really is going to say, hey, Judas, you've got the purse, go off to this nearby town and buy some bread so we can feed them. Because the people are, the disciples are aghast. They said that he couldn't possibly buy enough food for all of these people. But the question arises, why Philip? Now, this is, again, one of these highly specific details that you might be tempted to think John just made up for vividness. But you've got to ask somebody. I'll have him ask Philip. Again, if you read a lot of New Testament scholarship, they'll use words like, John puts this at this time. John has this happen. Luke has so-and-so say this sort of fictional language, all right? So maybe John just had Jesus say this to Philip. And that's sheer coincidence, right? He's got 12 disciples he could have picked. And Philip isn't the most likely. If you're going to just kind of grab somebody, have him say something to. The Gospels often emphasize that inner circle, Peter, James, and John. It might have been one of them. It might have been Judas. He was the treasurer. He kept the bag. All right, maybe he would have asked Judas. There could have been reasons for asking somebody else. Philip is random. He's just a random disciple. Well, maybe it was random, but it would be, and it could have been random in the real circumstance. Maybe Jesus did just choose Philip to play this little gag on, where can we buy bread? But it would be more satisfying in terms of reality if we had a more specific reason, and as it turns out, we do. But it requires putting several verses together. If you go to Luke 9, verse 10, it says that they came to a deserted place belonging to the town of Bethsaida. Bethsaida was not a very large town. It was on the northwestern coast of the Sea of Galilee, and there's even some debate about the location of the feeding of the supposed discrepancy connected with it. I'm here to tell you that the location of the feeding of the 5,000 is not an embarrassment to the apologist. The location of the feeding of the 5,000 in 2 places, remember I told you I'm only giving you one undesigned coincidence connected with the feeding, is actually confirmed by undesigned coincidences as being near Bethsaida. Luke is the only one who mentions this, just mentions it in passing. Luke doesn't mention that Jesus spoke to Philip, okay? Just mentions this location. Now we go to John 1, okay? 43 and 44, there are actually a couple places where John mentions this, but again, totally different contexts. This is the first calling of some of these disciples that Jesus called very early in his ministry when he was in Judea, after he had been baptized by John the Baptist and after he had returned from that and begun a Judean ministry. At the beginning, he calls his first disciples, and it specifically mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida. All right, totally different context. John just mentions this in passing. John never connects that with Jesus asking Philip, where can we buy bread? But it provides an extremely plausible reason that if Jesus is going to kind of give the disciples a hard time, hey guys, let's feed these people. Where can we buy some food to feed these people? Hey Philip, you're from around here. Where can we buy some food so that these guys can eat? Philip is a plausible person that he might have chosen. So now we have a very plausible explanation. I was reading an internet skeptic trying to deal with this one, and all he could find to say was, John adds Philip to the story. And John adds the location of the feeding as near Bethsaida to the story. Does John add the location of the feeding as near Bethsaida to the story? Nope. John never mentions that the feeding of the 5,000 took place near Bethsaida. You don't get that from John. It's not in John. It's not anywhere in John. He mentions Philip. Yes, that detail is only in John. In that sense, you can say he adds it, but I don't think he made it up. And this connects all these different passages in this wonderfully intricate way, far too intricate for it to have been done as a fake. Because how good is a fake that takes 1,800 years for somebody to notice? As far as we know, this was first noticed by J.J. Blunt in the 1800s in his book on undesigned scriptural coincidences. That's a pretty useless fake. And that's because it's so subtle. That's because of that appearance of undesignedness. So before we go to Acts, let's pause and ask, what do these show? What kind of a cumulative case am I building? For what kind of conclusion? Well, A, that the authors were close to the facts. B, that they were trying to be truthful. They weren't trying to fake stuff. They were trying to get it right. And when I say get it right, I don't mean in some weaselly literary sense. I mean get it right in the sense that we would talk about a witness in a courtroom getting it right. And third, that they succeeded. They were trying to get it right, and they succeeded in getting right. Moreover, this shows that they weren't just copying from one another, because they're making all these little changes, and it's wonderful to see how these go in all these different directions. Let me just tell you right now, because I know some of you are apologetics geeks, at least that's what Robert tells me, that this just blows out of the water all concern about the so-called synoptic problem. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If Matthew was written first, or if Mark was written first, and if Matthew and Luke have some degree of even literary dependence, if they read Mark and wrote down some of the things they remembered from reading Mark, digression. They did not have tables for writing. It's kind of important for redactive criticism, that they could not have had Mark laid out in a big scroll, and their scroll laid out in a big scroll, and copying, okay, and going, I think I'll change that part. So they probably, even if there was literary dependence, read Mark, and then folded it, rolled it back up, and got out their little lap desk and wrote their own gospel, maybe using some notes they had made and their memories. So even if they're literally dependent on Mark, it doesn't matter. It's just a puzzle as to where that goes. That's an interesting puzzle for scholars, but it doesn't mean that they didn't have independent access to true facts, independent of Mark. And it doesn't mean that Matthew's just redacting Mark or Luke is just redacting Mark when he changes something or writes something a little differently in his own account of a story. So you can sleep easy at night. If you've ever lost sleep over the synoptic problem, stop worrying about it and enjoy your life, because it's just a little puzzle. It's not a problem anymore for the reliability of these texts and for their accuracy concerning the life of Jesus Christ. Getting it right on these kinds of details is a mark of truthful witness testimony. And J. Warren Wallace talks about this a little bit in Cold Case Christianity, where he does just a few undesigned coincidences. That this is something you see. The truthful witnesses will often tell things that will fill in what other witnesses had said, but they do it unintentionally. And that's what we're finding here. Okay. You guys tired, or can we go on to Acts?
I'm good with it.
Keep going. Yeah.
Keep going.
We're
More.
good.
All
Can I
right.
ask a question?
Yes.
Are you aware of C.S. Lewis's remark, which seems to be related to the concept you're pursuing, that the Gospels either displayed a literary anachronism of an out-of-time appearance of a modern historical novel, or they were contemporaneous historical accounts?
Yes, I am familiar with that, and I think he's completely right.
Okay, so what you're doing is essentially fleshing in the details of his general claim.
Some of the details, yeah, and I think he has, there are other things. For example, just the quantity, the sheer quantity of realistic detail. Pick up the Gospel of John sometime and just go through and note all the times when he says it was this hour, or he'll even, like, the water pots at the marriage at Cana, he'll tell you how many gallons they could hold.
Some of
All
that
right?
stuff only
So that's
jumps out
another
to
thing.
somebody who writes. If you haven't written, it's one of those things that people, they don't see, because it's, if you haven't tried to do that yourself, you don't realize the difference between writing a bare bones fiction and writing a detailed description. So it's not, my impression would be this is not a compelling argument to someone who has not written themselves.
Well,
I think that's true, or maybe tried to tell a long, detailed, consistent lie and found it to be hard.
I'm not
I
disagreeing
agree.
at all. I'm just saying it just doesn't. My sense is, and I've had some engagement with people on related but not Christian topics, that people just don't understand what goes into actually trying to create a detailed account, and thus they
I
punish
think
themselves.
that's true. I think we're also very anachronistic. We're very steeped in our own culture. So we read stuff that sounds like this all the time, that people are trying to make sound really realistic, and we don't realize that didn't exist at the time. But I would also like to point out that even realistic novels don't have undesigned coincidences with one another.
Yes,
I have
know.
found, I mean, they just don't,
Well, some people
they
try,
don't
but they
do
screw it up.
Pardon?
Some people try, but they screw it up.
You will occasionally. I can tell you I found one, and they're in two different novels written by the same person, which helps, not by two different people, okay? And this is Marilyn Robinson, the author of Gilead, because she has another novel about the same time period called Home. And I found a kind of a weak, undesigned coincidence between Home and Gilead. There are also some discrepancies, by the way, in her chronology. But generally between novels, even quite realistic novels written by different people, you don't find these kinds of very accidental little detailed coincidences coming together. You will find allusions to the same historical facts. Two different things written about the French Revolution or something are going to refer to the same historical background. But this level of detail you don't find. So yeah, I do view myself as fleshing out what Lewis is saying, even going in a direction that I don't think he was familiar with.
no.
A very odd thing that I hadn't thought about till just listening to you. There is a huge body of Harry Potter fan fiction, and it is almost entirely based on the fact that J.K. Rowling could not keep her facts straight. And so she starts off in the beginning with a very whimsical novel and ends up with a very dark young adult novel. And the styles are completely incompatible. You've got Hagrid, who is wide as a sofa, and in a whimsical novel, that's perfectly okay. You don't have to question why he can get through the doorway. But then in the last novels, now it's realistic enough to where you're expecting that if Hagrid appears on the other side of a doorway, he actually had to have a physical way to move from one side to the other. And the fan fictions depend on all of those discrepancies. So it's an interesting outworking I had not thought of before of your idea that if it's not historical, it's going to look like what she did.
Yeah, you'll see the mistakes and discrepancies. Now, and one other thing about what you were talking about here is you're saying that it might not seem convincing to a non-writer, but this is the same type of stuff that's used in court cases, like you were saying. This is what you get when you get witnesses together and ask them about what happened in any everyday life situation. So it doesn't have to be other writers who are reading it, because you get the same thing in court.
Well, I just know I've had discussions on not this exact, but linguistic things with respect to some of the Old Testament documents and stuff, where people want to read back into the Genesis account a modern scientific conception. And I'm just going, nobody had those ideas then. You're trying to make people think in ways, no, there's zero evidence that anybody thought then. And I know that's completely uncompelling to most people. They simply can't imagine a world where nobody'd ever heard of gravity.
I think that we have a lot of anachronisms going. One that I often find is the argument from silence that skeptics will make. A skeptic on Jonathan McClatchy's Apologetic Academy got on the Q&A after I had given a talk on undesigned coincidences. He really changed the subject, and he spent a good 10 minutes wasting my time trying to get me to convince him that it was okay that other historians did not talk about the darkness when Jesus was on the cross. Like, why didn't somebody mention the darkness? Why didn't, argument from silence, on and on and on. And I finally said, yeah, surely someone would have live blogged it. I mean, there's this very anachronistic idea that there was a Jerusalem Times that had a reporter on the scene, and it was, News Tonight at 11. This is what happened at the cross, and it would be preserved, now for us to go back and read. People have no idea how anachronistic our sheer quantity of information is. So that's an example, too, of the inability to...
I grew up before the internet, when the sum total source of my information was a blue 1963 set of World Book. And if I wanted to look something up, I didn't have Google, that was it. And if I couldn't find it there, I lost the argument.
And that was better than what they had then. But yeah, I'm really interested in the Acts part. I have not gotten as deeply into the Acts as I did into the Gospels, so I'm really interested in this next part.
All right, let's do it. All right, some undesigned coincidences between Acts and the epistles of Paul. Now, one thing I'm going to tell you right now as I go in, these are not going to as often take the question-answer form. So sometimes when I introduce people to undesigned coincidences, the easiest way is to do the question-answer form. How did Matthew know what Herod said to his servants? Why did Jesus ask Philip? Why did Jesus say this to Peter? And so forth. Some of them will take that form. But it's good to understand that you can have undesigned coincidences that don't take that form. They're confirming, they're still, going back to the initial definition, incidental interlockings that point to truth. And they confirm some kind of fact, or maybe even a set of facts, but they don't necessarily, you can't present them. They're a little harder to present because you can't necessarily raise this question like, why did this happen or whatever. So I'll try to be doing some of that tonight to kind of show you a little bit of that variety. So I'd like to start with one. This is one of the only ones in the book that I found myself. The vast majority of the coincidences in the book I either found in William Paley's Horai Paulini, which I strongly encourage you to read, or I found in J.J. Blunt's Scriptural Undesigned Coincidences, which I also strongly encourage you to read. These are free on the internet because they're not in copyright anymore. Or I got from my husband. Sometimes he couldn't remember where he had read them, possibly in a commentary somewhere, or if he had thought of them himself. So I try to meticulously cite all of that in the book, in my footnotes or endnotes as they are. But this was one of the only ones that I found myself, and I found it because I have the NASB, and William Paley didn't. Okay, so we're working with a slightly different text family here that makes it clearer and that kind of brings it out better, brings it to light. So I'm going to go to Acts, and this is one that I am going to read. Acts 18, verses 1 through 6. After these things, he left Athens, this is Paul, and went to Corinth, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Now, there are more undesigned coincidences packed, even just in what I read, that I don't even have time to get to, about Priscilla and Aquila. But we must leave Priscilla and Aquila aside for the moment. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working. for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Okay, so we find a certain pattern. Paul is tent making most of the time to make his living, and then on the Sabbath, he's reasoning in the synagogues. Why is he reasoning in the synagogues on the Sabbath and not tent making on the Sabbath? You guys know the answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't he work?
He's a Jew.
He's a Jew.
Because he's a Jew. He's not allowed to work on the Sabbath. Okay. And you're supposed to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath. Okay. Forbidden to work on the Sabbath. Okay, but something changes when Timothy and Silas come. It says, when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. You'll find this translated was pressed in spirit in the King James and New King James and others based upon the majority text, which is a little cryptic. But of course, the whole thing is a little cryptic. It's a little cryptic here too, because Paul is pretty completely devoted to the word. That's kind of Paul. That's his personality. So it's really unclear what this means. And the author of Acts doesn't pause and explain what changed when Silas and Timothy came down. We can make some conjectures. And I'm going to see if you know this one. You've read it in the book. Don't tell. All right. What might have happened? What might have been different when Silas and Timothy came? What might have changed so that Paul became completely devoted to the word after they arrived?
Weren't they his scribes?
Was he showing off? Were they? That might have been scribes. That's a good one. Okay, maybe they could write for him. I think, though, it's talking about a verbal ministry because it says testifying, that Jesus was the Christ. So it seems to be a preaching ministry that he became more active in somehow.
Any chance?
Okay.
Any chance they brought money?
Very good. Did you already know?
No. I didn't.
Hey. Cheating. All right. I was going to say, how many of you would like to quit your day job and become a full-time apologist? Probably. All right. All right. Probably. I know there are a lot of people on the CAA who feel that way. People who will write similar to me, how can I have a career in apologetics, right? And most people can't. They have to work a day job. Well, Paul had to work a day job in order to support himself. But after they came, he didn't have to work his day job, at least for a while. He could devote himself completely to the word. Conjecture. They brought money. Not mentioned in Acts explicitly, but a pretty good conjecture. Now let's go to 2 Corinthians 11, 8, 9. I'm not going to read this one, but Paul is getting touchy about money. It's 2 Corinthians 11. Paul is often touchy about money. That is a part of his personality that we find in the epistles a lot. And he says, I was not a burden to you when I was in Corinth. That's where he is. He's in Corinth. He's writing to Corinth. But when I had need, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied my need. He doesn't even name them. But he says they came from Macedonia, which is exactly where Timothy and Silas came from. At this time, they were following up. They were coming behind him. And they brought him money. And you also find in Philippians, where he's, as you know, Philippians is a thank you note for money. And he's talking about how they, more than once, had sent him money. They sent him money in prison, and that's what he's immediately writing thank you for them. But he mentions that they have frequently sent money to him. So, and Philippi is also in Macedonia, so maybe this money came from Philippi. We don't know. But what we can see is that 2 Corinthians confirms Acts. Because 2 Corinthians explicitly says that men came, Christian brethren came from Macedonia and brought money to Paul in Corinth, which is what we could conjecture from the somewhat cryptic note in Acts might have happened. All right, let's do another one. 2 Timothy 1:5 and 3:14 through 15. Again, I'm not going to read these, but in these we find Paul talking about Timothy's upbringing. And he's reminding him of his upbringing, and he's saying all these warm things, and about how from the time Timothy was a little child, he's known the scriptures, which would, of course, be the Old Testament, especially if Timothy knew it from the time he was a child. All right, those would have been the scriptures that were available. And he knew it, he says, they were taught to him by his mother, Lois, and his grandmother, Eunice. Who is missing from this picture?
Dad.
Dad. Where's Dad? All right, this is a pretty patriarchal society. And there's an implication here of Judaism, because Timothy's being taught the scriptures from childhood. He's being given a Jewish upbringing. Where's Dad? Especially since Paul goes to the trouble to actually name his mother and his grandmother. He knew the family. But he doesn't mention his dad. Now, we could make a couple conjectures about this. Maybe his dad died. That's a pretty obvious thought. But maybe also, another thought, maybe he wasn't a Jew. That's also possible, and therefore wasn't involved in his upbringing and learning the scriptures as he normally would have been if he was a Jewish father. Well, we go to Acts 16, beginning, and we read those first verses, completely independent appearing context. The author of Acts is simply talking about Paul meeting Timothy and how he decided to take him on a journey with him. And it says that he took him and he circumcised him. Timothy had gotten to be an adult without being circumcised, and Paul was trying to, cater a little bit to the sensibilities of the Jews in those parts. So he circumcised him, and it said his mother was a Jew who believed, but his father was a Greek. And the Jews in those parts knew that his father was a Greek, so he circumcised him. Notice there's no mention of his mother's name. Grandma doesn't make an appearance at all in Acts 16. No grandma. All right? There's no appearance here that Acts is based on 2 Timothy. And indeed, I think 2 Timothy, it was written years later. And that Acts the author of Acts wouldn't even have had access to it. But just in case that thought crossed your mind, it doesn't appear to be based on it at all. He's just explaining how it came about that Timothy hadn't been circumcised and was already an adult, that he had a father who was a Greek and obviously not a believer, but that his mother was a Jewess who believed. And as you probably know, in Jewish culture, your Jewish identity is reckoned through the mother, even though father would have been very involved in his upbringing if he'd been Jewish. But whether you're counted as a Jew or not, and this is true among Orthodox Jews to this day, is reckoned by whether your mother was a Jew. So Timothy was officially a Jew, and he'd even received a Jewish upbringing, but his father had drawn the line at his being circumcised. So when Paul decides he wants him to travel with him, he has to circumcise him. So this is a confirmation, again, of the accuracy of Acts, and that the author of Acts is connected with Paul and with Paul's doings. Just as we saw in Acts 18, he seemed to know that Paul's ministry model changed when Silas and Timothy came. Here, when he first meets Timothy, he knows all these little intimate details about Timothy and his mother and who she was, and that he had to be circumcised, and his father, and that his father was a Greek, which is confirmed by 2 Timothy. All right, this next one is a little more complicated, so pay attention. I want to read Acts 19, 20 through 21. This is flyby territory. This is something that you would find a little boring if you're reading this. And if you followed certain schools of thought, according to which it's only the big events in the Gospels and in Acts that we can take to really be historical, and the incidental details are dubious or might have been fictionalized, you're not going to think much of this little passage here. Now, after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem, after he passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, "After I have been there, I must also see Rome." And having sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. Now, where is he in this chapter? He's in Ephesus, known as Asia at that time, Asia Minor. This is modern-day Turkey. Little note about Paul's planned itinerary. He was planning it out. He was going to go to Jerusalem, but before he went to Jerusalem, he was going to go through Macedonia and Greece. That's what Achaia is. Achaia is Greece. And planning from there to go on to Rome. And he sends ahead. He doesn't leave yet. this is just his plan. He sends ahead of him Timothy and Erastus into Macedonia. Okay. Boring. But it's not really all that boring. One thing we might wonder is, could the author of Acts have really known Paul's inner thoughts? We're talking about what Paul is thinking, what he's planning to do. This is the same kind of question I raised concerning Herod speaking to his servants, which is, how could the author of Acts have known what Paul was planning to do before he ever did it? Couldn't this just be kind of this vividness thing? And so Paul was planning to blah, 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 because later I'm going to say that Paul did blah, 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 blah. So I'm going to now have Paul plan to do all that. Okay, we might think that. And he sends Timothy and Erastus ahead, and he stays in Ephesus for a while. Now, what I'm going to tell you is that in these boring verses, I find details that permit me to place to the verse the writing of the epistle of 1 Corinthians. Kind of interesting. There's no mention of 1 Corinthians in these verses. In fact, there is no mention anywhere in the book of Acts that Paul ever wrote a letter to anybody. Let me repeat that. Acts never mentions that Paul ever wrote a letter to anybody. But I can place to the verse within the book of Acts, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, 1 Thessalonians. I also think I can place Galatians, but that's way more controversial, so I won't claim that one, because there's a gigantic controversy about when Galatians was written, but I think it was written about the same time as Romans. All right, so I won't claim that one. But the point is, because Acts is so richly verified by the epistles, and so beautifully and so indirectly and so meticulously tied in to little things in the epistles, we can place these things. In fact, I'm probably not even going to have time to tell you all the reasons for placing 1 Corinthians in those verses that I just read to you, but I'll give you some. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 16, 5 through 10. I want to back up, actually. He tells them in the verses before that to collect money for Jerusalem. There is, by the way, no mention of this collection anywhere in Acts. And yet the itinerary that Paul followed to collect this money and his traveling to Jerusalem to deliver it is found in the epistles and is followed in Acts. Acts has one very indirect reference to his having been bringing money. He mentions this to one of the Roman officials later on. But when he's actually doing it, Acts doesn't mention that he's doing it. All right, so he's going to collect this money. He was taking up fundraising for the poor saints in Jerusalem, and he was going to bring it. And he says, when I arrive, whomever, this is verse 3, whomever you may approve, I shall send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. And if it is fitting for me to go also, they will go with me. So he's planning to go to Jerusalem. Check. Point 1. But I shall come to you after I go through Macedonia. For I am going through Macedonia. And perhaps I shall stay with you, or even spend the winter, that you may send me on my way wherever I may go. He's writing to Corinth. Corinth is in Greece. Greece is called Achaia. So he's saying, first he's going to go to Macedonia, then he's going to come to Achaia, then eventually he's going to go to Jerusalem. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's the same itinerary he's planning back in Acts 9:18. All right? For I do not wish to see you now just in passing, for I hope to remain with you for some time. Oh, did I skip verse 6? That's important. And perhaps I shall stay with you or even spend the winter. We'll talk about that in a second. That you may send me on my way wherever I may go. For I do not wish to see you now just in passing, for I hope to remain with you for some time, if the Lord permits. But I shall remain in Ephesus until Pentecost. For a wide door for effective service has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. Where is he writing from? Ephesus. So he's in Ephesus. Check. He's planning eventually to go to Jerusalem. Check. He's planning to go by way of Macedonia. Check. He's then planning to pass into Achaia. Check. And spend the winter there. Get to that too. Oh, and by the way, there are many adversaries in Ephesus. Check. Because there's about to be a riot in Acts 19. That's the greatest Diana goddess of the Ephesians riot. All right, verse 10. Now if Timothy comes, see that he is with you without cause to be afraid, for he is doing the Lord's work, as I also am. If Timothy comes. Another point of contact is that Paul has apparently sent Timothy to that direction, toward the Corinthians, and he may come as far as Corinth. Hey, Acts 19, he sent Timothy and Erastus on ahead into Macedonia, which is that route by which they might continue and come down south into Achaia. But apparently he expects his letter to arrive before they do. How do you know that? Well, because he's saying, if Timothy comes, right? So he expects the letter to get there. He's already sent Timothy. But if he arrives, and there's actually another verse, I didn't write down the reference for it here, where he says, I have sent Timothy. That's actually in 1 Corinthians. And now he says, if he comes, don't diss him. Treat him with respect. I was always a little concerned about this because evidently Timothy was not a very impressive guy, and he was young and a little diffident, and he wanted people to treat him with respect. So he's sending this letter on ahead. Somehow the letter's going to get there before Timothy does. I don't have a map. There's a map in the book. Buy my book. All right? Called Two Routes to Corinth, where Timothy's going a long way. All right, and if he gets to Corinth at all, which he may not have, he's going to get there. It's going to take him a while, probably a few weeks at least, if not a few months, even if he hurries, okay, up overland. But there's a sea route directly from Ephesus to Corinth, right across the Aegean. It was a pretty widely traveled trade route. And if you know Paul, this guy would have been using email, he would have been using Twitter, he would have been using instant messaging. He wanted his communications to get there fast. He was an obsessive letter writer. He would have sent, and he's very concerned about the Corinthians too. If you read 1 Corinthians, he would have sent that letter by the fastest route. So the letter would get there before Timothy did, because we know from Acts, Timothy had been sent on ahead by the long route, by the overland route. It all fits together. Now I'm going to do the winter part that I promised you about. Go to Acts 20. It's traveled through Macedonia and taken some time. We don't know exactly how much time. I'd say probably about 8 months or more going through Macedonia, wandering, traveling, and given them much exhortation. Verse 2, Acts 20, verse 2, he came to Greece, and there he spent 3 months. And when a plot was formed against him by the Jews as he was about to set sail for Syria, Syria is where Jerusalem was located, he determined to return through Macedonia. Little passing detail, he spent 3 months there. He was there for 3 months. And onward goes the author of Acts. Oh, and I hope to come to you and spend the winter. Right? There's the winter. All right? So we can place the writing of 1 Corinthians so precisely, and then this intersects with other undesigned coincidences as well, which really gives us confidence in Acts. Because it's so indirect, it's so beautiful. And the author of Acts apparently knew Paul. And I'm going to do one more Acts 1 here. This will be the last undesigned coincidence I'm going to do. In Acts 28, verse 20, Paul has come to Rome. He's been brought to Rome as a prisoner. And there he is. He gets together. Paul's always trying to make contact with people and preach the gospel. So he gets together the Jewish leaders in Rome who haven't heard anything about it. Unlike the Jewish leaders who've come from Asia and from Jerusalem, they don't hate him. They don't know anything about him. So he wants to get his word in first. So he gathers them together, and he tells them what's going on and so forth, and why he's been sent and so forth. And he says, for this reason, therefore, I requested to see you, Paul says to the Jewish leaders in Rome, and to speak with you, for I am wearing this chain for the sake of the hope of Israel. And now I want to jump down to verse 23. And when they had set a day for him, they came to him at his lodgings in large numbers. They're coming to talk to him. I need to skip back to verse 16. When we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself, with the soldier who was guarding him. That's my fault for not writing that one down. Verse 16, he was allowed to stay with the soldier who was guarding him by himself, and he has lodgings. And then in verse 23, they come to him in his lodging. Okay, so we here have references to the way that Paul was imprisoned in Rome. And we find Paul is such a drama queen. I love Paul. All right, he's talking to these guys and he's going, "For the cause of the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain." You can picture him rattling it. All right, this chain, singular. All right, I'm bound with this chain. And then it says that he had a soldier, singular, who kept him, and he was allowed to stay by himself with a soldier who kept him. Why is this interesting? Well, if you now go to Ephesians 6, 19 and 20, chances are, in your translation, you will not find the important point, because virtually all of the translations translate it just slightly wrong. I think because it sounds better. And I'm very fond of the phrase, an ambassador in bonds. This is found in the King James. Other translations usually give the phrase with the plural, chains, bonds, etc. And Paul says, very similar, for the mystery, for the sake of the mystery of the gospel, I am an ambassador in bonds or chains or something. But guess what? It's singular. It's not plural. I am an ambassador in a chain, singular. And we have back in Acts, for the cause of the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain, singular. Why is singular important? Well, if you go to Josephus, you find that he discusses, and there are other places where you can find this too, a method that the Romans sometimes had of keeping prisoners. The prisoner would be bound by a chain to a soldier. Usually they didn't want to use two soldiers, although you do find back in Acts 12 they did use two soldiers for Peter. And there you have two chains and two soldiers. But here, it was one chain, and Acts refers to the soldier that kept him. And so apparently the author of Acts knew these specifics, both about what Paul said and about the method with which he was imprisoned. But again, this is very, very indirect. We just find him saying in Ephesians, for the sake of the mystery of the gospel, I am bound with a chain. I am an ambassador in a chain, singular, which appears to indicate the same method of imprisonment. Now think of all the things this has implications for. If the author of Acts was with Paul in Rome, this has implications for the dating of Acts, for one thing, because he's been following him breathlessly on the boat, right? And he's apparently with him at this very time. He even knows what's happening and how he's bound and what he says to the Jewish leaders, and then screech, it all comes to a stop, right? Very abrupt. And I think this is indirectly an argument that the book of Acts was written quite early, and that it was written before Paul's case came to a decision. Not everybody agrees with me, but I think this evidence of the presence of the author with Paul at the very end of Acts and his knowledge of details about Paul's imprisonment is evidence for an early date for Acts, and evidence of that immediacy, that he got it published, as it were, when all of this was hot off the press, but before Paul's case. Paul sat around for 2 years, it says, and it hadn't come up yet, and so he gets it off to Theophilus so that Theophilus can read what he's composed and has written. That is an indirect argument. I'm not saying it's not down, but I think it does contribute to that. So it's got all these implications. But most of all, it has implications for the reliability of Acts. Acts is incredibly reliable. And the author of Acts is also the author of Luke. That's undisputable. Which means Luke is also written by this very reliable person. So I want to recommend a couple of books. I've already recommended The Horite Paul and I. I've already recommended J.J. Blunt's Scriptural Undesigned Coincidences. If you're really into this stuff, I also want to recommend a book by Colin Heemer called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Yes, I know it sounds hard, and it is a very scholarly book. Hemer was a very great scholar, but it's just such a great corrective to a lot of nonsense, and beautifully written, just a joy. And it is in print. Don't go to Amazon to look for Hemer. Go to the website of the publisher in America, Eisenbrauns. They have it in print. If you look on Amazon, you'll find some, wild amount for an out-of-print copy or something. But look it up, search for Eisenbrauns, Hemer, Book of Acts, and you'll actually find the publisher's website, and it's more reasonable there. So there are these other things to read, lots more to read, and of course, all right, this is what truth looks like. This shows that we can present the Gospels as a whole as reliable documents. It also means that we should be more confident that the detailed accounts of the resurrection really were what the disciples testified to. We should not throw the details under the bus. Don't throw details under the bus. If you take one thing away from my talk tonight, that would be it. Do not throw the details under the bus. It allows us to take a more forward position in our apologetic enterprise and to present the argument from the resurrection as Paley presented it, and the older apologists did, because they said either the disciples were lying or they were having just the craziest hallucinations you ever heard of, crazy group of hallucinations, or they were telling the truth. They presented this sort of trilemma. And that way of doing it has fallen out of favor because people have said, oh, come now, we don't really want to have to argue against the entire New Testament scholarship guild, establishments, that they really testified to that stuff about him eating fish, that they really testified to that stuff about him talking to them for 40 days. Let's just take a more minimal approach, that they had some kind of experiences, etc., and we weaken our case unnecessarily. We don't need to weaken our case like that. We can take that forward position, which is what my conclusion is called, reclaiming the forward position, and argue like Paley did, that either they were lying or they were having crazy hallucinations, or they were telling the truth, because these would be really crazy hallucinations. This wasn't just some fleeting little thing they testified to. So undesigned coincidences are not just a curiosity. They fit into an exciting, wider apologetic framework, and I hope that you will study them and come to love them as I have and fit them into that wider framework. Okay, we'll go to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Lydia.
Hey, thanks, Lydia.
I truly appreciate that. One question that came up for me with the Philip example is when immediately after saying that Jesus asked Philip, Andrew's the one who finds the kid with the fish, it looks like. Andrew's also from Bethsaida.
Yes, Blunt noticed that. I don't think I put that in my book. I don't think I had read that yet, or I hadn't noted it yet in Blunt. But yes, that's correct. So they're all kind of standing around.
Right. I didn't know if that was considered part of the coincidence or if that would just be a couple of disciples running around asking. But that struck me as,
I haven't brought it up. It's even possible Andrew knew him. I mean, that's a conjecture, of course. He certainly does appear in the narrative right away. It's also possible that Philip and Andrew were a little bit close as friends because they came from the same town. They appear to have known one another previously, so then they might have been physically near each other on the occasion. Again, these are just possibilities, but they do fit together. It certainly fits in.
Thank you.
I had a quick question. You may have mentioned it, but I didn't write it down. Way back to the very beginning of your talk, you said some skeptics say Matthew just copies earlier Mark, but then you said Matthew has info not in Mark. Did you give a verse, or were you just saying in general and look for it in my book?
Well, the example I gave about to his servants is an example. To his servants is not in Mark. And yet the passage is very much like the passage in Mark. And that's part of what makes it so cool, because even skeptics will say they always have to have a source, Nobody ever had contact with the truth. Everybody always had contact with a source.
Exactly.
And again, this isn't just skeptics. So they'll admit something that sometimes gets called special M. And that's like these large amounts of material that are in Matthew that are not in Mark. But when it comes to a passage like this one that is substantially similar to Mark, you almost never get them to admit that Matthew had independent evidence that just gets kind of inserted there in a little passing detail. And that's what makes this one particularly cool, is that it's so similar to Mark, and yet the one thing that's different is something we can confirm. And there are a few more of those in the book as well.
I'm quite unfamiliar just with this in general. Do you see much in the way of, arguing against you? What are some of the biggest challenges you are facing? I guess, and Tim as well.
Well, Robert asked me that when we did a sound check last week as well. No, wait, did you? Did you ask me that, Robert?
I don't think I did. I don't think that was one of my questions. I could be wrong.
Kurt Yaros asked me that when he interviewed me on Veracity Hill a couple weeks ago for his podcast. And for one thing, the book's only been out since March, so we could just start there.
You still, I guess you still have Paley and stuff writing in the past. Has there been anybody responding to this on the other side, I guess?
Not generally. For one thing, the argument's been lost.
Okay.
It's, certainly not in contemporary times, 20th century and later. It just kind of fell off the map. So we don't have a lot of responses. Tim debated Bart Ehrman about this on the unbelievable show, Justin Brierley's show out of England. And what was really striking to me is that Bart had not prepared to discuss undesigned coincidences. You can go watch it. You can go find it. He managed to get it to his comfort zone with arguing about the authorship of the Gospels, and Justin had billed it as a discussion of undesigned coincidences, and then Tim kind of had to fight tooth and nail to bring back in undesigned coincidences. And it was very clear that Ehrman had so much disdain for this argument that he had not even bothered familiarizing himself with it. And at a certain point he said, "This sounds like some kind of 19th century apologetic."
Well, that's actually what as I was listening to this, and we've been doing wedding stuff for the last 2 weeks, so I'm coming in completely in medias res. And I don't know what the back context of this, but I'm kind of listening to you, and I'm going, okay, who's the audience for this argument? There was a time in my life some years ago where this would have been very encouraging to me, when I was reaching the conclusion that inerrancy was a logical impossibility, but reliability seemed to be established, but I couldn't find anything that was helping me answer the question, how reliable?
Yeah.
I know that coming from the background I did within the PCA, the inerrantist wing of evangelicalism, this argument strikes me as being completely uncompelling, simply because they're already presuming that. You're arguing ground that they've already accepted. So, it's sort of like, okay, yeah, so. On the other hand, on the other side, where people have accepted full-blown textual criticism, they haven't gotten what you're describing Ehrman doing. They haven't accepted enough of the Bible for this to have any weight, because they've already pushed it aside before you're ever going to get into those kind of details. And they might listen to it in very broad stroke, like C.S. Lewis put it. But when you get in, I'm kind of wondering who's actually listening to this among people who are questioning. I can understand that people who are already Christians, they are thinking of themselves as apologists, that the argument is interesting to them. But I'm not sure who out there is questioning something that the argument is, who are those people that this is answering questions to?
That's a good question. The first thing I want to say is, this is showing that Bart Ehrman's wrong.
I understand that.
Let's just start there. Yeah. All right. If people, I guess what I want to say is, I do not want to think of people as static. I do not want to think of my audience as locked in. Oh my gosh, you're Bart Ehrman. You're locked in. You're never going to listen to me. Well, yeah, if you're Bart Ehrman, literally, you're probably never going to listen to me. All right. But I want people to be rational. And a rational person who has accepted all kinds of these assumptions of higher criticism, not just textual criticism, but higher criticism, redactive criticism, source criticism, etc., is hopefully, one could hope, capable of changing his mind. All right? And what this does is it just blows it away. One of my favorite endorsements of the book was by a scholar named Rob Bowman, and he said, Lydia McGrew is the anti-redaction critic. It's one of the blurbs in the front of my book. It said she comes in to the, I don't remember the exact quote, but something like, she comes into the courtyard of the New Testament scholars and turns over the tables. And I was just flattered beyond words by that. This is what I want to do. I want to come into the courtyards of the New Testament scholars and turn over the tables. So if you are even thinking, and there are people like this, take my word for it, who are on the cusp of being influenced by Bart Ehrman, or have begun to be, but are still willing to look at another side, or are saying, oh man, it's looking like all this was just something they just wrote, they just redacted earlier sources and so forth, and they're not maybe entirely happy about it. Are they willing to think again? This should make them think again. This should make them think twice. So, sure, might I be a voice crying in the wilderness? Yes, to the extent that my audience is filled with Bart Ehrmans, they're not going to change their minds, but I can hope that they would see that this is contrary to their assumptions.
No, I want to get your book because I can see that it has real utility in answering the question, if the Bible's not inerrant, what is it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that I can see, and I can see that for a lot of younger seminary students today, that it would be very, very relevant because they're kind of looking at things that they weren't allowed to look at 2 generations ago, a generation ago. And now they're looking at...
I'm hoping to stop them from going too far in the other direction.
And honestly, when I first started Question, I was stuck between a dilemma because within the communities that I was in, inerrancy was the shibboleth. If you and going back to the Chicago statement and all, if you weren't inerrancy, you were far left liberal. And there was no place in between. And I spent 20 years feeling... Well, C.S. Lewis was my lifeline because I knew he was a Christian, and if you read enough C.S. Lewis, you eventually discover that he was definitely not an inerrantist. So I see a place, but I'm not seeing it apologetic.
Well,
let me jump into something else. Tell me what you've written about
let's see what you have to say about that first. What was that, Lydia?
So, let me get to the inerrancy. So first of all, I've sort of addressed the Bart Ehrman side of it, that I'm hoping to show that he's wrong and that we don't need to concede stuff to him. And I also want to say that what you're bringing up here is very relevant to something I'm fighting right now. I'm fighting the inclination in many to throw what I call reliability as well, and then still to call that inerrancy, which is a very weird move that's going on, like what I would call neo-inerrancy, where we're having them all filled with fictionalization, and that's wrong too, okay? So, but then to talk about inerrantists, I talk to a lot of inerrantists. I mean, I'm planning to give a talk this coming Saturday at a women's conference, and I'm pretty sure most of the audience are inerrantists. I've given talks to smaller groups that I'm pretty certain are inerrantists and presented on this. And you'd be surprised at how many inerrantists are quite happy to have their conclusion defended from a different point of view. They're quite happy. They're not going to say, oh, well, I knew that already. All right, you don't find very many of them doing that. It's a little bit like presuppositionalists who also like evidence. All right, and in fact, it's really a species of the same
irrationality.
Yeah, species of the same genre of the same species. It's an instance of the same thing. That you'll have these people who say, well, I just presuppose all of this, but it is really a good thing to have it defended from another angle as well, from a purely historical angle. They get excited about it, and they get excited about it for their children. Because you can have the most devoted inerrantist, and he's going to know in the back of his mind that his kid's going to go to college someday, and he's going to have this all attacked from every possible angle. And he's happy to have more strings to his bow to say, yeah, we can know that the Bible is God's word. And frankly, I present it that way. I don't lead with the question of inerrancy. I don't walk in and say, hey, by the way, guys, I'm not really an inerrantist, but please listen to me anyway. Now, if somebody asks me outright, I will give them a little disposition on that and where I fall on that continuum and on that spectrum, and I think I have an interesting position. But usually I wait to be asked.
Have you published it?
I'll walk right. Yeah, I'll do it. I'll walk in, though. It's what I'm saying to an inerrantist audience. I have no qualms whatsoever about saying, I'm here to strengthen your faith. I'm here to strengthen your kids' faith. I'm here to provide evidence that the Bible is true.
Well, I'll throw out something that doesn't apply to many people, but there are some. For me, and this was true when I was 16, When I read books, I was already questioning this, and when I was given books on inerrancy and they started off with evidence, I just quit reading. Because logically, I knew at that point they'd given up the game.
Well, they didn't believe that.
If you give me evidence to prove inerrancy, evidence can disprove inerrancy. Evidence can never in 1,000 years prove inerrancy.
Unless you can prove every single fact.
Position, isn't it?
Well, isn't it? I mean, it's logically necessary, isn't it?
One of the things also for me, you talk about audiences. My son, one of the first apologetics things that happened with me is my son watched the movie Zeitgeist. He watched the religious section of the movie Zeitgeist, which is all about, Jesus is just one of the sun gods. He's taken after Attis and, all these different things. The Bible is written 300 years later. Well, this stuff disproves that 300 years later. It's Jesus is just a representative of the sun gods that came before him. Well, this shows that these are things that were actually happening in life. He's not just some made-up figure taking the place of other sun gods that came before. He's not somebody made up 300 years after the fact. Anybody who's questioning in these areas, this defeats that. in my view.
Sure. I mean, it's certainly about mythicism or any more extreme position. It absolutely is. I should also add there are inductive inerrantists. Not all inerrantists are deductive inerrantists, like what you're describing. There are people, I know some of them, who would consider themselves inerrantists on an inductive basis. In fact, I think William Lane Craig may identify himself in this way, that he's an inerrantist because he doesn't see any reason not to be, because he's found these things to be, and I could be misrepresenting Bill, but I think this is his position, because he hasn't found discrepancies that are so hard to harmonize that he has lost faith of harmonizing them, and because he's found so many confirmations of reliability, and that cannot be a legitimate way to reason. If you just keep finding it's true inductively, one does extrapolate. If you keep pulling balls out of a bag and it's white ball, all right, eventually you do come to the conclusion that all of the balls in the bag are white. Now, I'm not sure that's absolutely true in terms of not a single error, no matter how trivial in the text, but I also can see a rational inductive case being made for inerrancy, and I can see someone shifting from being a deductive to being an inductive inerrantist, and this could help with that as well.
I have a question about something you said that really intrigued me, because I've thought about this off and on all of my life. By the way, when I was in college many years ago, I went to a conservative college, it's Christian Liberal Arts College, and we did a synoptic gospel course, which back then my professors actually brought out some of the ideas. And as you talk, I wonder, is there anyone engaged in textual criticism that in your opinion is after truth as opposed to source?
Okay, that's a very good question. And I would want to distinguish textual criticism, which is sometimes called lower criticism, from higher criticism. But I think your question applies to the New Testament scholarly guild more generally.
Right.
In a number of weeks, on November 4th, I'm going to be giving a talk right here. If someone wants to drive to Michigan, I'm going to be giving, I don't know if it will be recorded, a talk to a CAA group that I'm going to call 7 Bad Habits of New Testament scholars and how to avoid them. And I'm going to be kicking rear ends and taking names. I'm going to not pull any punches. The field of New Testament criticism is rotten to the core.
That answers my question. I had another question too, though, and that is, you mentioned that you had a unique view of inerrancy, and I've always been trying to find a unique view of inerrancy. So could you briefly share your unique view of inerrancy?
Sure. Well, I don't call myself an inerrantist. I try to be really careful about this. Have you ever seen Bart Ehrman debate someone? You know what the first question is he asks them? Are you an inerrantist? And he will badger until he gets an answer. And if he doesn't get an answer, he'll say, oh, you're dodging, All right? So if he asks me that question, I'm not going to debate Bart Ehrman, by the way. But if he asked me that question, I would say, no, I don't consider myself an inerrantist. And this is for 2 reasons. First of all, because as was mentioned here, usually the term is more often used for what I would call a deductive inerrantist, who takes it a priori. There absolutely cannot be any error in the Bible, okay? So it's just an assumption. It's not even susceptible to any disproof. I mean, it doesn't matter. You could bring anything in there, and nothing would shake that assumption. So I'm definitely not a deductive inerrantist like that, and most often that's how the word is used. Second reason is that I do have what I like to call candidate passages. And I'm more familiar with the Gospels than I am with the Old Testament. I know the Old Testament as well, but that's what I've been immersed in recently. So I have some candidate passages in the Gospels. Can't think of any in Acts right off the bat, but where I think there may be a minor factual error. And I consider this to be actually a good thing. And I know it's like, why? How could that possibly be a good thing? Well, when we work in courts, not that I work in courts, but when we modern people do, and we work with witnesses, we find that real witness testimony has this lovely untidiness to it. And I really want to teach people to love that. The texture of real witness testimony. This is going to guard you against being too liberal as well. Believe me. This is going to anchor you, because when you get that wonderful texture of real witness testimony, you are not going to be susceptible to this pull leftward to saying that all that matters are the core events and the Gospels are only sort of kind of reliable on everything else because they were fictionalizing and making stuff up. And that's all nonsense, because you're going to sense that it's contrary to what you're finding when you're reading them, which is that texture of real testimony. But when we find a texture of real testimony, we find that they don't always agree. It happens all the time. Apparent discrepancy is the name of the game. And sometimes real discrepancy. Sometimes they get something just a tiny little bit wrong. And Paley once said that the normal character of truthful witness testimony is substantial agreement under circumstantial variety. All right? So that's what we find. We find substantial agreement under circumstantial variety. When you get that circumstantial variety, that's a proof that they didn't just copy from one another. That's how we know that the redactive critics are all out to lunch, and that they really knew these events, many of them, sometimes by actually witnessing them or by talking to actual witnesses, and sometimes actual witnesses who are truthful, who are generally highly reliable, will get some small thing wrong. And I think this may be what the Holy Spirit allowed are these, again, few. I do not have a ton of candidate passages. I want to emphasize that. A few places where they may have just remembered something wrong, and that reminds you of people you've known who are truthful. You would trust them. You trust your life to them. You know they're not lying to you. They're not making stuff up. They're not faking things. And frankly, I regard it as much better to be willing to have a couple of small errors like that than to retain the name inerrancy, as some are doing now, and I'm writing against them very passionately.
Have you articulated this in writing?
Pardon?
Have you articulated this in writing? This is much better shaped than what I've come to in my own thinking. But have you put this in writing?
Yeah. If you read my blog,
okay.
Go to what'swrongwiththeworld.net and look at the evidentialism and the New Testament threads.
Okay.
And look up the name Lacona.
Oh yeah.
I said it.
Spell it.
Licona. Yes, he's visited my home. He's a great guy. He loves the Lord Jesus Christ. He is sincere. He is not
You do
stupid.
realize that this position, if adopted, completely undermines the style of preaching common to many evangelical ministers who, I'm exaggerating a little here, who base a sermon based on whether the article was A or the.
Actually, I don't agree. I don't agree. And this is the thing. Notice the little itty-bitty details that my talk was just based on.
It's not that. It's
The
not
very
that.
last one I just gave you a sermon on whether the word hallucin was singular or plural in Acts. So actually, if you get a high enough reliability, go for it. Base it on whether the article was A or the. You'd be surprised at how little how little distance there is. I've been called an inerrantist in all but name. I think the person intended that as an insult. Okay? Because I engage in almost as much harmonization as Norm Geisler. Okay? I engage in almost as much harmonization as the most committed inerrantist you can find. Why do I do that? Because it's good historical practice.
Makes
all right?
sense.
That's a good historian working. You don't have to believe that they're divinely inspired to be a really, how can I put it, hard-working harmonizer. I love harmonization, all right? I do it all the time. So actually, I think those little nitpicky details are super, super important.
If they have done the work you've done,
about
but mostly, in my experience, they have not. If you go and challenge them, how do you know that this is the right article, not that one? I mean, there's a whole body of literature that I'm sure you're aware of about Christ with Peter, do you love me, do you love me, do you love me? And the change of words there, and from what I've seen, not being a Greek scholar, this is just a man speaking normally, Christ speaking, do you love me, do you love me, do you really love me? But the whole theological weight on, did he say phileo or did he say agape, it won't support that. I
don't agree. I think Jesus really probably did use different words. Okay. Why not? Jesus was a genius.
People use different words, but if you're going to preach, you're speaking from, as it were, the voice of God in a sense. You have to, if you're going to get up and say, now this sermon is just my own speculation. I'm not really sure if this is all true.
But you can see what word was used in the Greek. I mean, you can see what Greek words were written by John.
There. If these are eyewitnesses, what did I just give you? I just gave you an undesigned coincidence from that very passage in John 21. I'm supporting that there was an eyewitness there. His name was John. All right, that's my position. And he wrote down what he remembered. I think John actually had a photographic memory. I think he really did. I think he had the most amazing memory. And he wrote down what he remembered. I think he remembered that Jesus said those Greek verbs. And do you know how radical a position that is in New Testament scholarship today? That John was written by John? A couple of months ago, I was sitting with a bunch of apologetics geeks around a table, and we had an apologist there I'm not going to name, and I think very highly of him, and that's part of why I'm not going to name him, but we got talking about authorship, the authorship of the Gospels, and he went into this sort of little rant. He said, nobody believes that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then he stopped, and he corrected it. So he said, I want to go back and correct myself. Actually, there is a revived belief that maybe Luke was written by Luke and Mark was written by Mark, but nobody outside conservative evangelical circles, which he identifies himself with, believes that John wrote John and Matthew wrote Matthew, the idea being that the only reason we believe this is because we're conservative evangelicals. Well, I want to say I believe that John wrote John because that's the way the evidence points. That's where the evidence goes. And I think Matthew wrote Matthew because that's where the evidence goes. And I'm going to stand up and defend that to anybody. And that's really radically right-wing, okay? As she was pointing out, even among relatively conservative New Testament scholars, to say that is pulling to the right. So I think you can preach those same sermons. You could preach those same sermons from my perspective. You're right that some of the philosophical backdrop to it is more or less a dictation view of inspiration of Scripture. That's not going to be your rationale for it, but you can put a different rationale there and still defend these very small details as being with very high probability true. And as Bishop Butler wrote long ago, probability is indeed the very guide of life. And we need to embrace that, thinkers called moral certainty. I'll stop.
Well, I was just saying that because your picture suddenly disappeared and the volume went dead.
Woo! Okay, let me try that again.
Who was your quote
did you
from
lose
that?
me?
Probability is the very guide of life. Who was it said
Butler.
that? Butler. Okay.
Butler.
And that's about where it went out.
That's when it went out. I said, I only have a very high probability that I'm sitting here speaking to you as opposed to dreaming this. And the older writers referred to what they called moral certainty. They used that word. It wasn't mathematical certainty. It was moral certainty. It was what we have in daily life. That's the certainty you have that your mother exists. You have technically, and this is my area of philosophy, I work in theory of knowledge, epistemology, technically you have only high probability that your mother exists. But that's not just mere opinions of men. That's not just my conjecture. I mean, nobody says that about my mother exists, okay? Nobody says that about this book exists, this table exists. We operate on the basis of high probability all the time. And I believe we can have high probability that the Bible is extremely reliable, and in particular the Gospels and Acts that I'm writing about here, down to some very small details that allows us then to get devotional material from them. And in fact, in my story, my version here of the washing, the foot washing, I was, in a sense, trying to illustrate the way that this argument can feed into personal devotion. I really think I've grown closer to the Lord Jesus Christ through this argument, because it enables me to see him as a real person, not as a flannel graph figure, that I can see him washing the disciples' feet, and I can see him sitting down and talking to them, and I can see them bickering because I have eyewitness testimony that shows what these people were like.
Hey, Lydia, I've got one other thing to mention, which is your book goes completely New Testament, Acts, absolutely fantastic, showing the coincidences there. But there are a bunch of these in the Old Testament too, right? And I think I've seen some of these from Jonathan McClatchy. Is that correct? That he's been doing some work in the Old Testament on some of these same items.
He's started doing that. He's pulling them out of Blunt. If you get Blunt, you'll find the Old Testament ones. In fact, more of Blunt's taken up with the Old Testament than the New. The Old Testament is harder for a couple reasons. First, it covers so many more years. Okay? So we are so lucky with the Gospels. We're talking about a 3-year period. We have 4 different books set in the same 3-year period. That's amazing. That's an amazing wealth and density of material in a short time. Obviously, the Old Testament, it's like Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. It's covering hundreds and hundreds of years or more. So that makes for a less dense presentation. Also, in many cases, even very conservative scholars, and I mean genuinely conservative scholars, don't know for sure who wrote the books. You look up who wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You know, you're going to find some conjectures. We don't know for sure who wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles, who wrote 1st and 2nd Samuel. I mean, Samuel dies, so obviously Samuel didn't write all of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Okay.
Oh, there are people who would say that he did.
Well, after he died.
Scholars, but I'm again different levels of
Sure.
people.
So authorship's more uncertain in the Old Testament. That's what I'm getting at. Even from quite a conservative perspective, very conservative perspective, authorship's more uncertain. So it makes it harder to say, well, this was definitely a different author. I find myself when I do Old Testament ones more often saying, well, this is from 25 chapters later. I don't think this guy was going back, even if it's the same scribe who pulled it all together in the end. I don't think he's going back 25 chapters earlier and pulling some little detail and putting in an incredibly casual connection to it 25 chapters later. So I find myself doing that type of argument more, which some people don't find as convincing as they do in the Gospels, where even though authorship is controversial, that they were different authors is not controversial. I mean, obviously, whoever wrote Mark is not the same guy as whoever wrote John, and so forth. So that makes it a little more difficult. But Jonathan's been pulling out some great ones. I pulled out a few. I've gotten kind of sidetracked into this neo-inerrancy thing, the evaluation of Mike Lacona's latest book. So that's kind of where my energy is going right now. I was going to do a series on Old Testament undesigned coincidences as well. And there are some goodies out there. So read Jonathan, and on what'swrongwiththeworld.net, you can look up Old Testament undesigned coincidences, and I've got a couple there too. Oh, another thing that has been mentioned to me is that the Old Testament ones are harder because people don't know the background as well. So from a rhetorical point of view, it takes more to set it up. So you have to talk about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom and Jeroboam and Rehoboam and, you know, who was whose grandmother and that kind of thing. So it does take longer to set up.
That makes sense. Anyone else? Dr. McGrew, I truly appreciate you being with us this evening. This has been fantastic. I've loved this argument ever since I've heard about it, and having the expert of the 21st century, one of the true experts in this field, lecturing to us this evening. Has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great to be here. I've enjoyed it. My email is lydiamcgrew@gmail.com. Feel free to email me if you have further questions. I do a lot of correspondence. I'm off Facebook right now, but the nice thing about that is it gives me more time to correspond with individuals. So feel free to do that. The book is available on Kindle. If you like to read Kindle, it's just $9.99. If you are interested, it's also available in paper, of course. If you are interested in doing it in your Bible group, like a Sunday school or something, email dan@deward.com if you want to ask for bulk pricing, like you want to get 10 copies or more or something like that for your Sunday school group, and they will discuss bulk pricing with you for the physical volume. And also, as you can see here, I am available to Skype, and I can give shorter Skype talks too, not just really long ones like that. All right.
You said Dan at where?
It's been great. What's that?
Dan at where for the bulk?
Deward.com. DEWARD. That's the publisher.
Okay.
Deward Publishing in
Well, I'll just say,
Ohio.
it's really interesting to hear from someone who knows the Bible and also is fluent in English. Not all that common. But I guess that probably has to do with your PhD.
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of apologists now, apologetics is having a great revival, and they are very eloquent. And I think we've got some great eloquent people out there. We just did a conference here in Kalamazoo. We had some great speakers here.
Well, thank you very much. And
See you later. Good night. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
you as well.